I trust the peace of God is reigning in each of our hearts this morning. I want to thank many of you who encouraged me last evening. Many of you did, and I just feel encouraged in that sense this morning. I went on a walk and I was overwhelmed with a deluge of more thoughts, and I'm feeling a little overwhelmed of we could take this in many different ways, and I just ask for your continued prayer. I trust that the Lord will lead my mind as I stand here and have me share what I need to share and leave unsaid what needs to be left unsaid. I want to thank the youth. I felt like you were extremely attentive last night. And that means so much to me. The burden for this message comes from a question and answer session that I participated in about a little over a year ago. And I'm glad someone asked this question, because it has led me on a study that I really believe could change the destiny of at least some, I'd like to believe many men and boys and people. I believe ladies are included in this. They say that the average person knows half of what he's ever going to know by the time he goes to first grade. And the reason we quit learning after we go to school is because we quit asking questions. We become self-conscious and ashamed to ask questions. And I'm glad someone asked this question. It's not the only time I've been asked. I've been asked this question many times. I don't know what made it more poignant. Maybe it was because it wasn't a question and answer session. I don't know. We hear the reference from time to time that a tsunami is upon us. And when they say that, they're usually saying it in reference to all the immoral iniquity around us. But I also believe that there is awakening up. I believe there is revival happening. That is why we are addressing this today. That is why accountability groups are sprouting up amongst our churches and in the land. But shouldn't the people of God be able to stop the quake that starts a tsunami? Shouldn't we, in our walk with the Holy Spirit, shouldn't we be aware of things that are coming in the future, and in this way stop these things before we have to deal with the after fact? In Proverbs 22, it says that a prudent man foresees the evil and hides himself. And I'd like to think that as Anabaptists, we should be discerning enough that we should be able to see the evil before it happens to our children and do something about it, because it says the simple, the fool, the people that aren't aware, the people that aren't discerning, they just simply walk on, and it says they're punished. And I'd like to be able to light a spark of hope in each one of us that by God's grace we can somehow be better aware of the evil that is coming and the evil that is already in our midst, and do something about it so that we can avoid being punished. The question that was asked is, how young should we fathers talk to our children about their sexuality? Is there a danger of damaging their innocent minds with too much information, or by sharing these things with them too young? Could our good intentions actually be a stumbling block for them? And the title of this session is The Talk. And the reason I named it that is because we often refer to that talk, and by saying the talk, we're referring to that subject that, somehow our children and young people are just supposed to know what that means. But something about this question, how young, is it possible that we could do it too young? Is it possible that we could damage them by giving them too much information too young? Something about this question, pious and careful as it sounds, simply didn't ring right to me. Another thing that didn't ring true to me is that we often ask it in reference to our boys. I believe this needs to be taught to our children. As men, we often speak from a male perspective because that's what we know. But I believe that by God's grace, we need to be able to do this for our daughters as well. And as I speak, I'm going to be making reference to our children. There may be times when I specify boys, but it's for our children. And the more I started studying this question, the more shocked, amazed I became. And as I studied, I began wondering if right here might lie the answer to some of the destruction that is on us. I don't know if the methods that the Anabaptists used 60 years ago worked for them or not. I wasn't there. All I know is that the current method that our churches are using, or we as families are using, is not working. And as I was wrestling with all these thoughts and questions, I suddenly started asking myself, you know how you do sometimes, you wonder if maybe you're just going crazy. I started wondering what if it's just me that's thinking that our system isn't working. Maybe it's just me because of what I experienced. Maybe most people out there aren't having that experience. How can I know? And all of a sudden, one day I had an idea. I said, I'm going to do a poll. So I got my phone out, and I looked up 30 men among my contacts. All of these men are from conservative Anabaptist churches, ranging in ages from 20 to 65-ish. And I asked them, when you were growing up, did your dad ever talk to you about your sexuality? And I selected only men that I didn't know well enough, because I have friends that I know well enough, if I would ask them that question, what their answer would be. So I specifically asked men that I didn't know well enough that I would not know what their answer would be. Their answers were almost exactly what I expected. And to me, it gives me a clear indication why the Anabaptist Church is where it's at today. Would you like to guess, out of 30 men, how many men said their dad never said a word to them about their sexuality? Thank you. I really appreciate that interaction. And just say what comes to mind. It don't matter. 19 out of those 30 men, their dad never said a word to them about their sexuality. 8 of the 30 men said they had what they would consider an unsatisfactory conversation with their dad, or their dad had with them. They also said, these 8 men said, that they could tell that their dad was extremely stressed, he was extremely nervous, and they could tell he was only doing it as an obligation to get this thing over with. One man told me he could tell that his dad would have preferred to load 5 semi-loads of hay by hand than have that conversation with him. Another man said he thinks that's what his dad was trying to convey to him one evening when he took him down to the basement. But the conversation was so vague and so much guesswork in it that even today he has to believe that that's what his dad was trying to do. And now I'd like you to listen to this. Even so, all 8 of these men expressed thankfulness today that their dad at least tried to do that. And out of the 30 men, there were only 3 that were completely satisfied and fulfilled with all the information that their dad gave them in regards to their sexuality. Do we think we're playing housey or what? Housey is a term that me and my sisters had when we were little, and we would make little houses with chairs and sheets and stuff. And this is where, as I went on a walk, my mind just got overwhelmed with so many thoughts. So what are 67% of us fathers and parents thinking? Do we really think that our children are just going to bump along in life and not know anything about their... do we really think that they're going to be okay with that, and that they're not going to try to figure it out? As I put these numbers into perspective, all of a sudden I saw something really clear this morning. In a church community of 10 families, that means that 7 sets of parents aren't saying a single word to their children about the biggest subject of their lives after God. This is the biggest subject of our lives and our children's lives after God. Do the children and young people from 7 families in your church, if you're living in a church of 10 families, do the children and young people of 7 families in your church seem disillusioned with the church? Do they seem to be disillusioned with life and the gospel in general? Does it seem to you like they don't have purpose in life? Now, do the children and young people of 2 families in your church, do they seem to be undecided which crowd they want to hang out with? Do they seem wishy-washy to you, like they don't really have their minds made up what they want? Do the children and young people from one of your families in church, it just seems they get it? It seems they have purpose in life. It seems they are useful in life. They are builders in the kingdom. It seems they have a straight purpose and course set for them in life. Can you see where I'm going with this? All of a sudden, it seemed like I was seeing an X-ray of what is going on in our midst. And I'd like us to put a finger on that thought in our mind and hold it there until tomorrow morning. Because somewhere out there, in a tiny ratio of 1 to 10, a set of parents are being true kings and priests within the sphere of influence that God has entrusted them with. Somewhere out there, in a tiny ratio of 1 to 10, some parents are doing it right. So then I went back and I asked the 19, so how did you discover these things in regards to your sexuality? And now I want you to listen closely. Thank you for doing so. Their answers all depended in which age group they were in. If they were in the older age group, they answered by saying, carefully ungluing some of the pages in the encyclopedia set that our parents had at home and from a depraved, close family member. If they were among the younger groups, like all of you young people here, their answer was the internet, and listen again, and a close, depraved family member. So all of these men, it didn't matter what age group they were in, all of these men that were not taught by their dad, one of the ways that they were all consistently taught by was a depraved, close family member. And I believe that this phrase, a depraved, close family member, should have alarm bells beeping off all over our brains. I'm kind of sad that there isn't time for a complete message, or could be a series on this topic of a depraved, close family member, teaching our children, brethren and sisters, about their sexuality, because we don't. I believe that when Jesus says a man's foes are those of his own house, I believe that he had in mind many, many more things than just persecution. Dear parents, it is not okay to let your children have sleepovers at Bachelor Uncle John's just because he is uncle and just because you pity him in his loneliness. There's so much I'd like to say on that. But I believe that this is enough to show us as dads that our children will learn about their sexuality in one way or another, whether we like it or not, and whether they learn it the way we want them to or not. And my question this morning is, so if they are going to learn it, by all means, parents, fathers, don't you think that your children should learn it from you who are the channel that God has established for them to learn these things? And now I want to turn to the Word of God and see what we can find there. God gives Moses specific instructions and commandments on our sexuality. In God's Word, we find instructions on how to handle everything from semen emissions and discharges to sexual relationships to periods, to the most romantic and beautiful descriptions of our sexuality that there are. But I'd like to ask all the pastors that are in here, please raise your hand. Thank you. Do we also understand that God commanded Moses to speak and teach these things to the whole congregation of Israel? Zach, would you pass that slide, please? There we go. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When a man hath a running issue out of his flesh, because of his issue he is unclean. This is the King James, and many translations, including the King James in Spanish, call these semen emissions. And further down in this same chapter, even in the King James, in our version, it's called the seed of copulation. And I read through the entire book of Leviticus, counting the times that God commanded Moses to teach these things to Aaron and all the congregation of Israel. And he commanded Moses 27 times. At the close of chapter 21, move that to the next slide in Leviticus, it ends like this: And Moses told it unto Aaron and to his sons and to all the children of Israel. Moses was faithful. Moses was obedient in teaching and commanding these things to all the congregation of Israel. In my nearly 50 years of age, I have never heard a pastor reading out loud Leviticus 15 to a congregation. Today, I could tell you, if you want to teach your children about sexuality, read Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Song of Solomon, and go home and consider my job done. Moses and Aaron didn't have that luxury. There was nothing to send their people home to read. I don't know. I have no way of knowing if it was awkward for them to tell their whole congregation like it feels to me today. One thing I know, it says they did as God commanded them. And I'm afraid, dear friends, that too many of us have chosen to believe that ignorance must be best in this area of our children's lives. And instead of it being a blessing to us, it has become a curse. In Hosea, move to the next slide, please. It says, God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no more priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. And how do we forget God's law? We forget it by not reading it, by not applying it, by not preaching it, by not teaching it, by not commanding it. That's how we forget to teach on these subjects, and that's why we get to where we're at today. What does God say? I will also forget thy children. Other translations, and in Spanish, many other translations say, I will destroy thy children. On to the next slide, please. I believe there has to be a way for holy men of God to be able to clearly teach a subject as big as our sexuality to the whole congregation. And according to God's word in Deuteronomy, fathers are then supposed to teach these things diligently to their children. And apparently from the day of Moses, from the day God gave these commands to him and Aaron, remember Aaron was a priest, until many years later it must have been customary for the priests to ask periodically if their people were morally clean. Because in 1 Samuel 21, when David was fleeing from Saul and he runs into the temple, he's hungry, he's asking for bread, and the priest tells him that the only bread he has is holy bread. And David was like, well, give me that then. And what was the priest's first question? He says, are you and your men clean from women? David's answer kind of cracks me up. He says, yeah, we've been clean for about 3 days. And you know, when we ask someone who's struggling how long they've been clean, and they go, I think it's about a week. True answer is more likely 3 days. Be that as it may, what impacted me here is that it's a priestly thing for us to be asking, point blank asking, our brothers if they are morally clean. And in Revelations, it says that God has made us kings and priests unto him, unto God. I believe it is a kingly thing to be teaching our children about these things. So how do we know if our brethren are clean or not? We have to do just like the priest did to David. We have to point blank ask them. I mentioned not letting our children have a sleepover at Uncle John's just because he's uncle. So how do we know if Uncle John is clean or not? You point blank ask him. And if his testimony is in accordance with the fruit of his life, and you discern that it's okay, then it probably is. But if one of the parents, if you or your wife isn't completely settled about the children having that sleepover, brothers and sisters, then you better not. I have always found, if in doubt, don't, almost always holds true. I know the children want too bad. I know that, it'd be easier just go sleep over there then. And then we tag on a couple other requirements or, laws to make sure that, we're still in control. And, and years later, I think it's a priestly thing for us pastors to know where our brothers in church are at morally. How do we know? We point blank ask them. And I believe I'm so encouraged to see accountability groups sprouting up amongst our churches. Next slide, please. Here in Deuteronomy, it says, thou shalt talk of them when thou, this is to fathers now. Remember, Moses and Aaron were supposed to teach these things to the congregation. And now the fathers, the parents, are supposed to be teaching these things to their children. This thing of 19 out of 30 Anabaptist fathers not teaching their children is not right. This has to stop if we want to get anywhere in life and in the kingdom, if we want our churches to prosper and grow. Thou shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And so on. You can read it there. What is teaching something diligently? Diligently means with consistent, conscious, persistent effort and attention. And in Spanish, instead of saying diligently, it says repeat it over and over. And I really like that combination of thought, diligent and repeating over and over. It's not easy to teach our children these things. It takes a lot of effort. One father last night told me he does not understand why it is so awkward and so difficult to do this. And I just thought to myself, dear brother, I know it is difficult to do this with our children, but just please pray for me tomorrow. It says we are to repeat the same things with conscious, persistent effort, and we are to pay attention. We must pay attention to make sure they are understanding what we are teaching them, just like a good teacher does in school. She repeats the same thing diligently every day. Then she pays attention to see if her children are growing in understanding. How many teachers are here? Right? That's how you do it? I mean, you just come and present whatever to your class and you do it one time because it's your obligation as a teacher, and you never come back and go over this again. How much is going to be retained by our children in school? How many parents would accept that kind of a behavior from a teacher? We would fire her fast. But for some reason, we've accepted to do it this way with our children. In this same way, we have to teach diligently. We have to repeat over and over. And we have to pay attention to make sure that they are growing in their understanding of this. Deuteronomy 6 doesn't sound like the talk. That thing where you briefly, vaguely, and awkwardly have that conversation. For those of you who read my story, I was faithful to my personal commitment of having the talk with each of my children. But I'm finding out that I failed for just having the talk. This subject of my children's sexuality should have been an ongoing conversation throughout their lives as they developed. We're not going to begin to explain the same things to a 5-year-old as we are to a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old or our daughter that's fixing to go into marriage. I mean, we have to teach this in accordance to their understanding. As they develop, it has to be an ongoing conversation. I've repented of this. I've told my children I'm sorry. And I'm blessed that these conversations are ongoing with them now. And there are so many opportunities, God-given opportunities for us to talk to our children about these things. Here recently, we were reading in Genesis how the angels came to Lot's house in Sodom and Gomorrah, and how the men of the city came and they surrounded the house and they were yelling outside, asking Lot to bring out those angels so that they could know them. And I was sure I had told my children this before, but I said, just for your information, this knowing was wanting to have sex with these angels. This knowing in the King James is the same as where it says that Abraham knew his wife. and she conceived and had a child. That's the same. And I was positive that I had explained this before to them. And the three youngest knew it, but for some reason it had slipped my oldest daughter. She's 25. And you could just see the look of amazement and wonder and then shock. It was like, boy, Sodom and Gomorrah were some kind of horribly wicked. You see what I mean? I mean, it's withholding rightful information to our children. Maybe some of you are having trouble with me bringing in the Old Testament as a commandment from God that we should be doing this as pastors and parents. I know that up until about a year ago, I would have had some problem with speaking this forcefully about something that was brought to Moses in the Old Testament. And I don't know why. I was never verbally just clearly told that the Old Testament isn't as valid as the New. But for some reason, that's the message that I received. That's the message that I understood, that the Old was for back then, the New Testament is for us now. Brethren and sisters, that is false. The Old and the New Testament are for us now. And when we look at the Old Testament as something that isn't necessarily as much for us today, it loses its convincing power in our lives. And if we continue in that path, the New Testament will lose its force in our lives as well. I remember when someone used to challenge me or question me on something because it was from the Old Testament, I could just feel myself just kind of wilt and maybe he's right. Maybe we can't put so much stock in it. All that changed for me a little over a year ago after studying 1 Corinthians 10. Next slide, please. Right here in 1 Corinthians 10, God couldn't make it any clearer that the Old Testament is for us today. And I'd like someone to please stand. I want someone to read these verses for us. Please stand. Please read them loudly, distinctly, and clearly.
Now these things were written for our examples, and the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted.
Louder.
Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play.
Louder.
That's pretty loud. Commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for our examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come.
Thank you. You did really good. I was just messing with you there. Could we all stand? I would like us to all stand, and I would like us all to repeat what's in aqua blue. And they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Now, who was the Old Testament written for? Can God make it any clearer? You can be seated. Thank you. Now I'd like to let Jesus' words sink deep into our brain. He makes it very clear that he did not come to abolish or destroy or put away the old law. He says clearly that he came to fulfill the old law. And then he says how he came to fulfill the old law. He says that before, if we kept ourselves from literally killing someone, we passed the test. He says that before, if we literally kept ourselves from committing adultery, we passed the test. But now he wants to take us beyond that. And he says that if we hate our brother, it's the same thing as murdering him. And if we're dirty in our mind, it's the same thing as if we would have committed adultery. And then I ask myself the question, so if in the old, God is asking pastors and parents to teach these things to their children, how could Jesus coming take this commandment to another level? And that is when Malachi 4:6 hit me. That is when I finally understood these verses like I never have before. Malachi 4:6, Jesus came so that a father's heart could actually go beyond mechanically teaching the law, and besides teaching, a father's heart could actually have the capacity to be turned to his children. And I'd like us to look what the last 2 verses of the Old Testament say. Next slide. Remember ye the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel with the statutes and judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to the fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. And all of a sudden I understood that all a parent could do under the old law was teach the law, mechanically teach the law. Jesus coming and leaving and going back to heaven so that the Holy Spirit could now dwell in us makes it so that us as parents, we as parents, can go beyond mechanically teaching the law to actually teach the law and have an emotional bond with our children as we do this. It seems that that capacity of being able to do that didn't exist under the old. But now we have that enormous gift. And for some reason, 67% of us Anabaptist fathers choose to not even teach what was in the old, much less through the teaching come into an emotional bonding with our children. So then I had the idea to ask all these 19 men, these 19 who their dads never taught a single thing to them about their sexuality, if they had family devotions growing up, guess how many said yes? All of them. 100%. So what I discovered is that the majority of the Anabaptist fathers are choosing to go back to the old, mechanically teaching, but only the parts that they're comfortable with. We're even doing worse than what they were supposed to be doing under the old. And we are totally missing the part that God is the most interested in. And that is why Jesus came to earth, why he gave his life. And that is turning our hearts to our children and helping them understand the biggest subject of their life after God. All of a sudden, I start seeing forces of darkness at work when I hear people asking, how long can I put this off? Who is behind our pious-sounding concern for the right timing? What if the right timing is more about our own comfort or accommodating our own lethargy than a true concern about our children learning too much, too young? What if the awkwardness of this whole thing is ours, not theirs? I guarantee you it is. One brother shared with me that his dad told me that one generation is too secretive about the subject, and the next generation is so loose that the children joke immorally about sex in the home. Brothers and sisters, fathers, that's not even what I'm talking about. Your children having immoral conversations about sex in your home has nothing to do with fathers taking their responsibility and teaching their children about this subject. All of a sudden, I just see bunny trails just popping up all over the place and excuses for us to not do our God-given command. Do you know of, or have you ever heard someone lamenting the fact that their father shared too much with them or that he did it too young? I never have. All I hear is the opposite. And this man that I'm going to share about, he isn't among the 30 that I polled. He's a man that God has given me the privilege to walk beside him to freedom. One day his dad told him that he needs to talk to him. He saw his dad was extremely nervous. He was 12. And finally, when his dad finally got out what he was going to say, he already knew what his dad told him since he was 5. His dad didn't tell him anything new. And later in years, when he was consumed by sexual addiction, he wanted to feel bitter towards his dad for not having talked to him like he should have. What if on this particular subject, we have done the proverbial straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel? Do the majority, I guess they must, of our fathers really believe that ignorance about our children's sexuality is bliss or the best way to raise our families? I already mentioned those verses in Hosea. And as I studied and reflected on these things, a question came back and it just hit me so forcefully. What if this lack of teaching is the reason that there is so much addiction and bondage in our midst? What if it is because of a lack of vision, a lack of being obedient to God's command in teaching the beauty and the purity of sexuality to our children, that our churches are where they're at today? The message that we so often give, it's not the words we say, but it's the message we give. We give this message unwantingly, but it's what our children and young people, 67% of them, perceive. And that is sex is complicated, it's messy, it's, we just shouldn't have anything to do with it. And then we tell them, well, save it for the person you love the most. All we're doing is presenting a confusing, dark, unbiblical, disastrous teaching. As I held up the things that I have just shared with you, it was like I saw an X-ray. And I saw generations of orphan spirits. Children who have not been able to bond emotionally with their parents. And all of a sudden, I saw something I didn't like. And we're going to speak on that this evening. Orphan spirits. 67% orphan spirits in our churches. Men and boys girls with aching hearts. Men and women who are wrongly reaching out to the very subject their dads avoided talking about for whatever reason or excuse. Vagabond, wandering spirits that ache as bad as any orphaned biological son or daughter. As Anabaptists, in appearance, we have accomplished many things well. Work ethics, honesty, to some extent, nonconformity with the world, non-resistance. But when it comes to the biggest subject of our children's lives, we are in ruins. And God says that because we have chosen ignorance, we will be destroyed. I believe our sexuality is important to God. I believe, in fact, that through our sexuality, we confirm to the spirit world who we really worship. And there are so many things, and there are so many things that I could share with you on this. Next slide. The Word of God begins in Genesis with the union of a man and woman and ends in Revelations with the union or marriage of Christ and the church. And I have this theory that God created the world and humanity, and out of that He raised up a bride, a church, because He needs a wife. Next slide. Our children need to learn that God has chosen and ordained that through sexuality they and every other human being enters into existence for all eternity. And this just really impacts me. Eternity somewhere. Next slide. The subject of our children's sexuality is a cradle-to-grave reality. And I've said this before. Next slide. Our children's sexuality is the biggest subject of their lives after God. I hear over and over from men who once lived in immorality and men who became clean through the blood of the Lamb, testifying that they are seeing God in ways they never dreamt possible. And from Jesus' words in Matthew 5, I believe it's my favorite verse, Matthew 5:8, I understand that God has chosen that through a holistic view of my sexuality is how I will be able to come to see Him. This is scary stuff, but I believe that it is only through a holistic view of our children's sexuality that we can expect them to see God. And how, brothers and sisters, how will they ever come to have that holistic view unless we teach them? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I believe that as parents, with our hearts turned to our children, it should make us tremble to think about the few and short formative years that we have with them. I believe this should make us take our responsibilities seriously. I think we should rethink our current strategy. Through everything I've been through, and little by little, I have this growing conviction that I have been called into God's kingdom for such a time as this. I really believe that our time together these 2.5 days is by divine ordinance. And I know that many days our attempts at thwarting or pushing back the tsunami that is upon us seems as feeble as the boy walking along the coastline, throwing one starfish back at a time into the water. I'm thankful today for the, 250, 300 people that are here. But really, for what we are facing, we should be in an arena that holds 100,000 Anabaptist fathers. But it doesn't matter if today we can make a difference in the life of one of our precious children. I have full conviction it's what we are called to do. And I believe it can actually turn into an exciting time in history for us to be alive and making a difference in the world. And as I began to consider the effect that maybe some of this teaching could have on some that are gathered here, it inspired me. What if us fathers all rise up and go home and do these things that God commands us to do? And recently I spoke at a men's conference, and so far all the testimonies from all the dads who have went home and had the courage to talk to their sons, they're expressing things that they never dreamt possible. The emotional bonding, the admiration that rises up from their little 8, 9-year-old son just blows their mind. And why is it so hard? One father was a truck driver, and school is out right now, so his 9-year-old son was riding with him. And all week long he was going to tell his son, and every day just would go by, and finally Friday came, and they were at their last stop to eat. And he said he told himself, he pounded his fist, and he told himself, I am not getting up from this table until I tell my son. Why do you think it's so hard? Because there is an enormous black demon out there that does not want you to have that bonding with your son. He does not want that little boy to have all of a sudden have his path enlightened, have his future protected. And that can only come from Satan, my friends. And they eat lunch, and his little boy says, ready to go, Dad? And his dad said, son, I am not getting up from this table until we have a conversation. And his other boys are already grown and married. And he had this conversation with his last 9-year-old. And he just can't believe what he experienced with him. I'm hoping fathers gather around the campfire. I hope you have these conversations with your children. I hope you will be obedient to God's commands and diligently teach these things. Have an ongoing conversation with your children about them. Maybe you feel like you're too old. Maybe you feel like your time is past. Well, if you're a grandpa, there's still time. You can teach your grandsons. Lord willing, tomorrow morning, I'm going to share about 1 hour that I had with my great-grandpa Simon. I only had 1 hour with him on this earth, and that hour changed my life. It is never too late. That's all I have this evening. The title is Orphan Spirits. It's what happens in our children and our young people when we as parents don't do our God-given duty, when we don't teach them. I ask you to continue in prayer and seeking the Lord's face in this. And it is a difficult subject. And if I have said something that is not according to the Word of God, feel free to confront me with it.